Story number 1. Growing up, I never understood why my mother avoided our family cabin in the valley. She'd inherited it after my grandfather passed, but we hadn't visited once. Anytime I asked why, she'd brush it off with vague excuses about work or how the place was too isolated. So when she reluctantly handed me the keys after I graduated college saying, "Do what you want with it," I didn't hesitate. The idea of a quiet retreat for a month to clear my head and figure out my next step sounded perfect. No deadlines, no noise, just me, the snow-covered forest, and the crackle of a wood-burning stove. The drive there was uneventful but long. The cabin was buried deep in the woods nearly 20 miles from the closest town. The final stretch was a narrow, icy road flanked by towering evergreens. My old sedan groaned as it climbed the last hill, and when I finally saw the cabin, it looked exactly like the faded photos Mom kept in a drawer at home. A rustic A-frame with a steep roof, tucked between snow-dusted trees. Quaint, cozy, but eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that feels unnatural, like the forest is holding its breath. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and mildew, the kind of scent you'd expect in a place left untouched for years. There were some essentials: a worn couch, a small kitchen with a stove, and a bedroom tucked into the back. The power worked, thankfully, and I found the water pump functional after some effort. That first night, everything seemed normal. I lit a fire, made myself some instant noodles, and sat by the window with a blanket wrapped around me. The snow fell in thick sheets, and the wind whistled faintly through the cracks in the walls. Peaceful, right? But by midnight, the peace felt wrong. The wind had picked up, howling outside, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I chalked it up to nerves. It was my first night alone in an unfamiliar place. Still, I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and kept the fireplace poker nearby, just in case. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound, a sharp, metallic clink. It wasn't inside the cabin, but it was close, just outside, near the front porch. I sat up, straining my ears. The sound came again. This time, it was followed by faint footsteps crunching in the snow. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer. But my pulse was racing, and I couldn't ignore the creeping sense of dread. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept toward the front door and peered through the peephole. The porch was empty. I opened the door cautiously, the freezing air biting my face. The snow on the porch was untouched, but just beyond the steps, I saw them. Footprints. Large, deliberate, and heading toward the woods. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The prints were fresh, meaning whoever had made them had been here minutes ago. "Hello," I called, my voice cracking. It echoed back at me, unanswered. The tracks led into the trees, disappearing into the dense shadows. I didn't follow them. Instead, I locked the door and spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room with every light on. The next morning, I ventured outside to inspect the footprints in daylight. They were even more unsettling up close, deep, with a stride too long for a normal person. Whoever had been here was tall and heavy. I followed the tracks for a few yards until they abruptly stopped. No sign of turning back, no trail leading further into the woods, just gone. By then, I was questioning everything. Had I imagined it? Was I just jumpy? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The cabin, once charming and serene, now felt oppressive. That evening, I decided to leave the porch light on and keep the rifle my grandfather had stored in the closet within reach. I sat by the fire again, forcing myself to relax, but when I looked out the window, I froze. Someone was standing at the tree line. It wasn't close enough to make out details, just a dark figure, motionless, half hidden by the trees. My breath caught as I grabbed the flashlight and rifle. But by the time I swung the beam of light toward the figure, it was gone. My chest tightened. I locked the doors again, triple-checked the windows, and spent the night wide awake, the rifle resting across my lap. Whatever, or whoever, was out there wasn't an animal. And I had the sinking feeling they weren't done with me yet. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time the wind howled or the cabin creaked, I imagined someone, or something, lurking just beyond the walls. By the time the sun rose, I'd convinced myself that leaving was the smartest move. Whatever charm the cabin once held had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing fear I couldn't shake. But when I stepped outside to pack the car, I stopped cold. The snow around the cabin was covered in tracks. Deep, erratic footprints crisscrossed the clearing, leading up to the porch, circling the cabin, and vanishing into the trees. I hadn't heard anything after the figure disappeared the night before, but these prints weren't old. They were sharp and fresh, like they'd been made only hours ago. My hands shook as I knelt to examine them. The prints were large, the kind made by someone wearing heavy boots, but something about them was off. The gait was irregular, almost as if the person had been limping or dragging something. "All right," I muttered under my breath, trying to steady my nerves. "It's time to go." I threw my bag into the back seat, grabbed the rifle from inside, and slid into the driver's seat. Turning the key, I prayed the old car would start. The engine groaned, sputtered, and then roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I backed out, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. Movement. I slammed the brakes, my heart pounding. Squinting into the woods, I could just make out a figure standing between the trees. It was the same shape I'd seen the night before. Tall, broad-shouldered, and completely still. I hesitated for a moment, gripping the wheel tightly. Then I floored it. The car fishtailed on the icy road as I sped away from the cabin. I didn't look back. Every instinct screamed at me to put as much distance as possible between myself and that place. The drive back to town should have taken an hour, but the winding roads felt endless. About halfway there, the car skidded to a halt. A tree had fallen across the road, blocking my path. "Of course," I muttered, slamming my hands on the wheel. The universe had a sick sense of humor. I stepped out, my breath visible in the frigid air, and grabbed the small axe from the trunk. As I worked to chop away the smaller branches, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the sound of the axe biting into wood. It wasn't until I heard the crunch of snow behind me that I froze. I spun around, axe in hand, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road stretching behind me, flanked by towering pines. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, but deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. No response. I worked faster, adrenaline fueling every swing of the axe. By the time I'd cleared enough branches to squeeze the car through, my hands were raw and shaking. I tossed the axe back into the trunk, jumped into the driver's seat, and gunned it down the road. When I finally reached the town's main street, relief hit me like a wave. The diner was open, its warm lights spilling out onto the snow-covered sidewalk. I pulled into the parking lot, practically stumbling inside. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, gave me a curious look. "You all right, hun? You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't know how to explain what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, so I just nodded. "Rough night at the cabin." Her expression changed at the mention of the cabin. She glanced toward the cook behind the counter, then back at me. "You're talking about the old Dayton place?" I frowned. "Yeah. Why?" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "Most folks around here avoid that spot, always have. Your family hasn't been there in years, right?" "Decades," I admitted. "Why does everyone avoid it?" The cook, an older man with a gruff demeanor, chimed in. "People say strange things happen up there. Disappearances, tracks in the snow that lead nowhere. My brother swears he saw someone watching him from the trees when he went hunting near there." I felt a chill creep down my spine. "Did he ever figure out who it was?" The man shook his head. "He didn't stick around to find out." I didn't say anything else. I just ordered a coffee, trying to warm up and make sense of everything. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore the tracks, the figure, the feeling of being watched. Something wasn't right with that cabin, and I had a feeling it wasn't finished with me yet. I thought getting to town would calm me down, but even as I sipped my coffee in the warm diner, my nerves stayed on edge. The waitress, Sheila, kept glancing at me from the counter. She looked like she wanted to say something, but couldn't quite muster the words. Finally, as I finished my cup, she walked over, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're not going back, are you?" she asked softly. "I'm thinking about staying in town for the night," I replied. Maybe figure things out tomorrow." She hesitated, then leaned closer. "Look, I don't know what's up there, but if I were you, I wouldn't go back at all. I've heard stories, and trust me, they don't end well." "Stories?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. "Hunters going missing. Campers finding things they couldn't explain, like blood trails that led nowhere, or noises at night that didn't sound human." I wanted to brush it off as small-town superstition, but the memory of those tracks and the figure at the tree line made my stomach churn. "You think someone's out there?" She nodded slowly. "I don't think you're imagining it, if that's what you mean. Just be careful." As I left the diner, her words stuck with me. I could have checked into the motel down the street, but something gnawed at me. I couldn't leave without knowing what was going on at the cabin. I had to go back. The drive was slower this time. The snow was falling heavier, and the winding road seemed even more isolated in the dark. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights or something worse behind me. But the road stayed empty. When I finally reached the cabin, I parked the car closer to the door. The porch light was still on, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. I stepped out, rifle slung over my shoulder, and scanned the area. The tracks from the morning were still there, but fresh ones overlapped them, heavier, deeper, and circling the cabin again. I gritted my teeth and pushed the door open, locking it behind me. Inside, the air felt colder than before, like the fire had been out for hours, even though I'd left the stove burning low. I set the rifle down on the table and lit the lantern, its warm glow chasing away the worst of the shadows. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Scratched into the wood above the fireplace was a word. Leave. My stomach dropped. I stared at it, my mind racing. It hadn't been there yesterday. Someone had been inside. "All right," I said aloud, my voice shaky. "If someone's messing with me, you got my attention." But no one answered. I spent the next hour checking every corner of the cabin. Closets, under the bed, behind the couch, nothing. The place was empty, but it didn't feel that way. It was the same suffocating sensation I'd had the night before, like I wasn't alone. As I sat at the kitchen table, debating whether to stay or leave, I heard it again. The metallic clink. This time it came from behind the cabin, near the woodshed. My heart thudded in my chest as I grabbed the rifle and flashlight. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon rummaging through the shed. But when I stepped outside and shone the flashlight toward the shed, the beam caught something that made my blood run cold. The door to the woodshed was open, swinging slightly in the wind, and in the snow leading to it were more tracks, larger than before, and unmistakably deliberate. I raised the rifle, my hands trembling, and moved closer. "Who's there?" I shouted. No response. The shed was small, barely large enough to store a few tools and firewood. The door creaked as I pushed it open with the barrel of the rifle. The beam of my flashlight swept across the interior. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Just an axe, some rusty tools, and a stack of logs. But then I noticed the back wall. Scratched deep into the wood, almost gouged, were more words. "You're next." I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The snow around the shed was trampled, like someone or something had been pacing there. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the flashlight. It was tall and broad, its face obscured by a hood or mask. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. Then it took a step forward. I didn't wait. I ran back to the cabin, slammed the door shut, and bolted it. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the door, gripping the rifle like it was the only thing keeping me alive. The silence outside was deafening. No footsteps, no movement, just the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then a single knock. Slow, deliberate. I stared at the door, paralyzed. The knock came again, louder this time. "Whoever you are," I shouted, my voice cracking, "leave now or I swear I'll shoot." The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from just outside the window, a voice whispered, low and menacing, "Too late." The voice outside the window kept playing in my head, low, deliberate, and unmistakably human. Too late. I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the fire, rifle gripped tight, scanning every corner of the room. Every shadow looked alive. Every sound set my nerves on edge. The fire crackled, but the warmth didn't touch me. I felt cold to my core. The trap by the door was my only defense, but I didn't trust it. Whoever was out there, if it was even a person, knew the terrain better than I did. They weren't just trying to scare me, they were toying with me. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to the faint sound of snow crunching. My head snapped up, heart pounding. The sound was faint but steady. Footsteps, circling the cabin. I moved slowly, grabbing the flashlight. The rifle was already in my lap. I turned off the lantern to keep the cabin dark and crept toward the window, careful to stay out of sight. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own breathing. Then, a voice, low, muffled by the walls but clear enough to make the hair on my neck stand up. "You think this door will save you?" The voice was calm, almost conversational. I didn't answer. My grip on the rifle tightened as I tried to think. Whoever it was hadn't tried to break in yet. Maybe they were alone. Maybe they didn't know I had a gun. "I know you're in there," the voice said again, closer this time. I stayed silent, heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps resumed, moving toward the back of the cabin. My stomach tightened as I realized what they were doing, checking for a way in. I hurried to the back room, crouching low to peek through the frosted window. For a moment, all I saw was snow and trees. Then, movement. A figure stepped into view, bundled in a heavy coat and hat, their face obscured by a scarf. They stopped in front of the window, staring directly at it, directly at me. I ducked, holding my breath. Had they seen me? "Why don't you come out and talk?" the voice called from outside, calm but laced with something I couldn't place. Mockery, maybe, or amusement. I couldn't stay here. If they wanted to come in, they would eventually. I needed to scare them off. I moved back to the main room, careful not to make noise, and opened the door just enough to shout, "I'm armed! If you come any closer, I'll shoot!" For a moment, there was silence. Then the voice came again, this time from the trees. "Armed, huh? Think you can shoot what you can't see?" A chill ran through me. They were moving now, circling again. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, retreating to the center of the room. The sound of footsteps stopped. For a long while, there was nothing but the wind. Then from just outside the door came a soft knock. Knock, knock. I aimed the rifle at the door, my hands trembling. "I swear to God, I'll shoot!" The knock came again, louder this time. "Open the door," the voice said, low and deliberate. "Let's settle this." My finger hovered over the trigger. "If you come in, I'll kill you," the voice chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You don't even know what you're afraid of, do you?" The handle jiggled, and I fired. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the small space. The door shook from the impact, and the handle stopped moving. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything. But the only sound was the faint echo of the shot fading into the woods. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, I found nothing. No blood, no body. Just fresh tracks in the snow, leading toward the trees. I slammed the door shut and bolted it again, the rifle still shaking in my hands. I stayed awake until dawn, every noise making me flinch. When the first light filtered through the trees, I gathered my things, ready to leave the cabin for good, but when I stepped outside, I froze. The tracks from the night before weren't just near the door. They circled the cabin in wide loops as if whoever was out there had been pacing, waiting for me to make a move. And on the hood of my car, scratched deep into the frost, was a single word: soon. I didn't bother cleaning it off. I threw my gear into the car and started the engine, my hands trembling on the wheel. As I drove down the winding road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. At the edge of the woods, barely visible against the snow, stood the figure, watching. I didn't stop. Story number 2. I remember the day I received it as if it were yesterday. The late afternoon sun dipped low, casting long golden shadows across the icy streets of our town. Winter was in full force, the kind that numbs your fingers even through thick gloves. I had taken a walk downtown, hoping to shake off the cabin fever that came with being snowed in for days. The air was still, too still, as if the entire world had been muted. The market square was sparse, with only a handful of stalls braving the biting cold. Vendors huddled in thick coats, their breath misting in the frigid air as they called out half-heartedly to passers-by. I walked among them, scanning their wares with no real purpose. My wife, Rachel, and I had been stretched thin financially, but I'd convinced myself that maybe I could find something practical. A second-hand heater, perhaps, or winter clothes for our son, Alex. The truth was, I needed to get out of the house. The weight of the season pressed hard on all of us. Rachel tried to stay upbeat, but I saw the way her smile faltered when she thought I wasn't looking. Alex's energy had been draining too, his usual laughter replaced by long hours staring out the frosted window. The bleakness seemed to seep into everything. I turned a corner, and that's when I saw him. A man sitting alone at a folding table bundled in layers of faded wool. His booth was nearly empty, save for a few odd objects scattered on the tabletop. A rusted lantern, a cracked porcelain doll, and at the very center, a small, unmarked wooden box. Something about the man made me hesitate. His face was mostly obscured by a scarf, but his eyes were sharp, almost too alert for someone sitting in the bitter cold. He nodded at me as I approached, his gloved hand gesturing toward the box. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice gravelly but calm. "What's in the box?" I asked, unable to look away from it. He tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the question. "A gift for the right person." I laughed nervously. "What's the catch?" "No catch," he said, his tone unnervingly steady. "Only a warning. Once it's yours, it's yours." I should have walked away. Every instinct in me screamed that this was a bad idea, but there was something hypnotic about the box. The carvings on its surface looked almost alive, twisting and shifting when I tried to focus on them. "How much?" I asked, my voice quieter than I'd intended. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he pushed the box toward me. "It's already paid for. Take it." I hesitated, but eventually reached out, my hands trembling as I lifted the box. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, the wood cold against my skin. As I turned to leave, I heard him mutter something under his breath. "What you take, you must return." I stopped, glancing back, but he was gone. The table, the lantern, the doll, everything had vanished. The street was empty, the eerie silence of the winter evening pressing down on me like a weight. When I got home, Rachel raised an eyebrow at the box. "What's that?" she asked, setting down a mug of coffee. "I'm not sure," I admitted, placing it on the kitchen table. The three of us, Rachel, Alex, and I, stood around it studying its intricate carvings. The box seemed to hum faintly, a vibration too soft to be heard but too strong to be ignored. I lifted the lid, and inside was a folded piece of parchment. The words on it chilled me far more than the winter air ever could. "This is the first piece. Keep it safe. The rest will come." I tried to shake off the note's unsettling message, telling myself it was probably some sort of prank. Still, there was something about the box that stuck with me. I placed it on the kitchen counter, brushing off Rachel's concerned glances, and tried to act like everything was fine. That night, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The wind howled against the windows, rattling them in their frames. Rachel and Alex had gone to bed, but I stayed up, staring at the box from across the room. Its dark wood gleamed faintly in the dim light, the strange carvings casting faint shadows. It was just a box, I kept telling myself. Just a strange object from a stranger with a bad sense of humor. But something changed. Around midnight, the lights in the living room flickered once, then twice, before going out completely. The sudden darkness was suffocating. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to cut through the pitch black. That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound like fingernails dragging across wood. The noise was coming from the box. I froze, the beam of light trembling in my hand. My first thought was that some kind of animal had gotten inside, but when I opened the lid, it was empty. The note was still there, untouched. The scraping stopped the moment I looked inside. For the first time in years, I felt real fear, the kind that makes your heart race and your throat tighten. But I pushed it down, closing the lid and carrying the box out to the garage. Out of sight, out of mind, I muttered to myself, though my voice sounded unconvincing even to me. The next morning, things only got stranger. Alex woke up complaining about a bad dream. "There was someone in my room," he said, his voice trembling. "What do you mean?" Rachel asked, her worry clear. "I don't know," Alex said. "It was just a shadow, but it felt like it was watching me." Rachel and I exchanged uneasy glances but brushed it off as a child's imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later that day, I went to the garage to grab my tools, intending to fix a loose cabinet door in the kitchen. The box was where I'd left it, sitting on a shelf near the back wall. But now, the carvings looked different, sharper, more defined. And there was something else. Resting on top of the box was a small dark object, a tooth. I recoiled, nearly dropping my wrench. It was human, no doubt about it. How it had gotten there, I couldn't begin to guess. I brought it inside, showing Rachel. "Do you think someone's messing with us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Rachel stared at the tooth, her face pale. "Jim, this isn't normal. You need to get rid of that thing." "I will," I promised, though I wasn't sure how. Dumping it seemed too simple, like it wouldn't solve anything. That night, I placed the box outside, near the edge of the woods behind our house. The wind had picked up again, howling louder than before. When I woke the next morning, the box was back on the kitchen table. No footprints in the snow, no signs of anyone breaking in. Just the box, sitting there like it had never been moved, and next to it, another note. "You can't give it away. It's yours now." The box seemed to become a permanent fixture in our lives after that morning. No matter where I moved it, how far I threw it, or what I tried to do to destroy it, it always found its way back to the kitchen table. The carvings on its surface grew more intricate with each passing day, as if an invisible hand was etching new patterns into the wood while we slept. Rachel stopped speaking to me about it. She refused to even look at the thing, her jaw tightening whenever she walked past it. Alex, on the other hand, had grown increasingly quiet and withdrawn. I caught him staring at the box a few times, his expression unreadable, and when I asked him what he was thinking, he'd only shrug and say, "It's just weird, Dad." But weird didn't begin to describe what was happening. It started small, things going missing around the house. First, it was Rachel's wedding ring, then a set of keys, and finally Alex's favorite toy truck. I thought it was just the stress making us careless, but then I noticed a chilling pattern. Each missing item reappeared inside the box, always resting on the same piece of velvet that had once been empty. When Alex's truck showed up, Rachel lost it. "That's it," she shouted, slamming her hands on the table. "We're calling someone. Anyone who can get rid of this thing." "Who are we supposed to call, Rachel?" I shot back, my frustration boiling over. "A priest? The police? It's a box. No one's going to believe us." "It's not just a box, Jim," she said, her voice trembling. "You know that as well as I do." I didn't argue. How could I? Deep down, I knew she was right. That night, I decided to confront the box head-on. I waited until everyone was asleep, then sat alone in the kitchen, staring at it under the dim light of the overhead bulb. The carvings had grown even more elaborate, and I could swear I saw them shift and twist when I wasn't looking directly at them. "All right," I muttered, gripping the edge of the table. "What do you want?" The box didn't answer, of course, but when I opened it, I found a new note waiting for me, written in the same jagged handwriting as before. "The second piece is coming." I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Alex didn't come down for breakfast. I went up to his room to check on him, only to find him sitting on his bed, holding something in his hands. "What's that, buddy?" I asked, my voice soft. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and glassy. "I found it under my pillow," he whispered, holding it out for me to see. It was a finger. I recoiled, nearly tripping over myself. The finger was pale and shriveled, the nail cracked and yellowed. I snatched it from him and stormed downstairs, throwing open the box and shoving it inside. The lid snapped shut on its own. When Rachel saw the look on my face, she didn't ask any questions. She didn't have to. We both knew we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. That night, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside our bedroom. They were slow and deliberate, each step accompanied by a faint creak of the wooden floorboards. I got up, my heart pounding, and opened the door. There was no one there, but when I turned back, the box was sitting on our bed, and next to it, another note. The third piece waits. I don't know if it was exhaustion, fear, or some twisted sense of obligation, but that night I decided to stop fighting the box. It seemed futile to resist something that kept defying logic and reason. The warnings, the grotesque items, the creeping sense of dread. None of it made sense, and yet it felt inevitable. Whatever this thing wanted, it wouldn't stop until it got it. Rachel and Alex were no longer speaking to me, not really. Rachel blamed me for bringing the box into our home, and she wasn't wrong. Alex wouldn't leave his room. He'd stopped eating, his once lively energy replaced by a blank, vacant stare. Every time I tried to talk to him, his only response was, "It's waiting, Dad." The third piece arrived 2 days later. I found it on the front porch, resting on a small pile of snow. It was a blackened, twisted fragment of what looked like bone. I didn't touch it with my bare hands. Using a towel, I carried it inside and placed it in the box, which seemed to vibrate softly as I closed the lid. "Is this what you want?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "What's the point of all this?" The box, of course, remained silent, but later that night, I found yet another note. "The final piece is within." The words sent a chill through me. Within what? The house? The box? Myself? I didn't know, but the message filled me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. By then, Rachel had packed a bag for Alex and herself. "We're leaving, Jim," she said, her tone final. "I can't stay here anymore. Not with that thing." I didn't try to stop her. Part of me wanted her to leave, to take Alex somewhere far away from whatever nightmare had invaded our lives. But as I watched them drive off into the snow, a crushing loneliness settled over me. That night, the box moved again. I found it in the basement, sitting on the floor like it had been waiting for me. Its carvings were more vivid than ever, the twisting lines almost glowing in the dim light. I opened the lid, expecting another note or a new piece of some grotesque puzzle, but this time it was empty. And then I heard it, a voice low and rasping coming from behind me. "You brought it home, Jim." I spun around, but no one was there. The basement was empty, the shadows deep and unyielding. "You know what it needs," the voice continued, echoing in my ears. I turned back to the box, my hands trembling. As I stared into its dark interior, I finally understood. The pieces weren't random. They weren't just objects. They were steps, leading to something final, something inevitable. The last piece was me. I don't remember much of what happened next. There was pain, sharp and consuming, and then darkness. When I woke, the box was gone. The house was quiet. The oppressive air that had lingered for weeks finally lifted. Rachel and Alex returned later that day, and though Rachel seemed hesitant, she hugged me tightly, relief evident in her face. But something had changed. I could feel it. That night, as I lay in bed, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror across the room. For a split second, I saw something in my reflection, a shadow, twisting and writhing just beneath my skin. The box was gone, but whatever it had started wasn't finished. And deep down, I knew it never would be, or would. Story number 3. Taking a walk past the market square where the cobbles shine slick with frost, and keep going until you reach the part of town people pretend doesn't exist. Cross the iron tracks. They creak even though no trains pass anymore. And keep an eye on the viaduct that looms like a broken promise against the sky. That's where it begins. That's where it always begins. You wouldn't catch most folks out there after dark, not in winter. The air tastes different, colder, sharper, and the silence feels alive, like it's listening. But if you asked around, they'd tell you about the man. They wouldn't name him. They wouldn't even call him a man, not really. Just the stranger. He'd been seen before, long ago. People who remembered would drop their voices to a whisper and say he only comes back when the town is sick. It was Maggie Kemp, the seamstress, who first spoke of him this time. She'd seen him, or so she claimed, down by the alley behind her shop. A tall figure in a long black coat, walking slow, deliberate, like he was searching for something. "Didn't see his face," she said, her voice trembling. But I felt it. He was looking right at me. The others dismissed her as a nervous old woman. But then Thomas Finn, the baker, swore he saw the same figure lingering at the edge of the square after sunset. He was just standing there, Finn told anyone who'd listen, still as death. And when I blinked, he was gone. I didn't believe a word of it, not at first. Stories like that had a way of taking root in winter when the nights stretched long and people's imaginations ran wilder than their senses. But then came the whispers, not from people. No, these were different. They rose from nowhere and everywhere all at once, like wind through cracks in a wall. They carried no words, only a feeling, a warning. I heard them for the first time walking home late from the mill. The road was deserted, the lamps burning low, the air biting cold enough to make you doubt the warmth of your own skin. The whispers followed me, curling around my ears, soft but insistent. And then as I reached the viaduct, I saw him. Tall and impossibly still, his silhouette cut sharp against the pale glow of the distant lights. His coat hung heavy, unmoving in the frozen air. He didn't belong there. Everything in my body told me so. He lifted his head, and though the darkness concealed his face, I felt the weight of his gaze. He raised a hand, slowly, curling his fingers in a motion that wasn't quite an invitation. It was something else, something worse. The air around me grew heavier, the cold biting deeper. My legs locked in place, caught between reason and instinct, and then, despite myself, I took a step forward. The moment I stepped forward, the world seemed to shift, like the ground itself had exhaled beneath my boots. The whispering grew louder, a low murmur rising to a hum, as if the stone viaduct were alive and straining against its own weight. The figure didn't move, but the air around him seemed to ripple, bending the night like a mirage over a flame. I stopped a few paces away, close enough to see him clearly now. He wasn't just tall, he was stretched, elongated in a way that defied reason. His coat hung too long, brushing the frozen ground, and his hands, gloved in black, rested unnaturally still at his sides. "Lost?" he asked, his voice low and steady, cutting through the hum like a blade. It wasn't the voice of a man. It was older, rougher, and it carried something with it, an echo of something I didn't want to name. I tried to answer, but my voice caught in my throat. He tilted his head just slightly, as though he could hear the thoughts I didn't dare to speak. "Don't worry," he said, taking a step closer. His boots didn't crunch on the frost. They didn't make a sound at all. "They all come here eventually." "Who's they?" I managed to stammer, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "The ones who wander too far," he said simply. His gloved hand gestured toward the tracks behind me. "The ones who cross without looking back." I turned to glance over my shoulder, but the tracks were gone. The viaduct stretched into darkness, and the world I knew was nowhere to be seen. Panic tightened my chest. My breath came in short, sharp bursts that clouded the air. "You've crossed," he said, his tone almost casual. "And now you'll listen." The whispering returned, louder now, swirling around us like a storm. It wasn't coming from him. It was coming from the viaduct itself. The stone arches groaned, their cracks bleeding shadows that moved like liquid. The whispers weren't words, not exactly, but they burrowed into my mind, planting memories that weren't mine. I saw a boy standing at the edge of the tracks, his face pale and his hands trembling. I saw a woman in a threadbare coat, staring at the viaduct as though it held the answer to a question she couldn't ask. And I saw myself stepping forward, drawn to something I couldn't explain. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The tall man tilted his head again, his gaze piercing through the dark. "Because you're here." Before I could ask what he meant, the ground beneath us shuddered. The shadows bleeding from the viaduct pooled around our feet, cold and viscous, pulling me down like tar. I stumbled, clawing at the air as the cold climbed my legs, numbing everything it touched. "You'll know soon enough," he said, his voice fading with the light. "They all do." And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the world went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the tracks. The viaduct loomed ahead, unchanged, and the town stretched out behind me, distant but familiar. The figure was gone, the whispers were gone, but the cold remained, burrowed deep in my bones, and I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. For days after that night, the whispers wouldn't leave me. Even in the heart of the town, surrounded by the warmth of the pub or the clamor of the mill, I could feel them just at the edge of my senses. They weren't sounds anymore, not really. They were thoughts that didn't belong to me, carried on the chill of the winter wind. No one noticed the change in me, but I noticed the change in the town. People moved differently now, quicker, with their heads down and their words clipped. The market square felt emptier, even though the same stalls stood in their usual places. It was like the town itself was holding its breath. I'd almost convinced myself it was my imagination until I overheard Grace Cooper, the apothecary's assistant, whispering to her employer. "The stranger's been seen again," she said, her voice trembling. "Near the docks this time. Thomas Blake saw him clear as day." Blake was a man I trusted, a fisherman with a steady hand and an honest mouth. When I cornered him at the tavern that evening, he didn't hesitate to speak. "I swear to you, I saw him," he said, gripping his pint like it might anchor him to reality. Standing there, looking out over the water. Tall, black coat, the whole lot. And when I called out, he vanished. It wasn't the vanishing that unsettled me. It was what came next. "And then the water," Blake added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It started moving. Not like a tide, but as if something was pulling at it." I wanted to dismiss it, to tell myself Blake had been deep in his cups or rattled by the cold. But his eyes told a different story, and deep down, I already knew he was telling the truth. That night I lay awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling as the whispers danced around the edges of my mind. They were louder now, more insistent, like voices calling from behind a locked door. And just as I began to drift into restless sleep, I heard something else, a knock. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight, like it had traveled far to find me. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the wooden door. I sat up, heart pounding, the room colder than it had any right to be. "Who's there?" I called, though I already knew I wouldn't get an answer. The silence stretched, and then the whispers returned, louder this time, wrapping around the room like a noose. They weren't coming from the door. They were coming from inside the house. I stumbled to my feet, the cold biting at my skin, and grabbed the lantern from the table. Its light barely reached the corners of the room, but it was enough to see the shadow standing by the window, tall, motionless, and impossibly dark. "Why?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Why me?" The shadow tilted its head, and for a moment the whispers fell silent. "Because you see," it said, the words low and guttural, as though they came from the earth itself. Before I could move, the shadow dissolved, sinking into the floor like smoke. The room was empty again, but the air was heavier, colder, and I knew the tall man wasn't done with me. The next morning, the town was buzzing with news. Maggie Kemp, the seamstress who'd first seen the stranger, was missing. Her shop stood open, the door swinging lazily in the breeze, but there was no sign of her inside, only a single black glove resting on the counter, as though it had been left there deliberately. Maggie's disappearance spread through the town like fire through dry timber, each retelling darker than the last. Some swore they'd seen her walking toward the viaduct the night before, her face blank and her steps mechanical. Others claimed to have heard her screaming in the wind that rattled through the streets. The glove found in her shop, black fine leather, matched the ones the tall man wore. I couldn't shake the feeling that her disappearance was meant for me. The whispers were stronger now, more coherent. They spoke in fragments, names and places I didn't recognize but somehow felt connected to. It wasn't just in my head anymore. The whole town seemed to carry the weight of those voices. Determined to find answers, I went to the one place people avoided most, the viaduct. It loomed ahead of me, its arches cracked and weathered, the frost on its stones glinting like glass in the dim light of dusk. The wind was still and the air carried the weight of something waiting. I reached the center of the tracks and stopped. "I'm here," I called out, my voice echoing through the arches. "What do you want from me?" The response came in the form of silence, thicker and heavier than anything I'd ever known. And then, from the shadows beneath the viaduct, he appeared. The tall man stepped forward, his coat brushing the ground, his movements deliberate and slow. This time, I could see his face, or what should have been his face. It was pale, featureless, like frost-covered glass that reflected only the emptiness around it. "You've come," he said, his voice as cold as the air. "I wondered if you would." "Where is Maggie?" I demanded, though my voice wavered. He tilted his head slightly as if amused. "She's where all the others are, where you'll be soon enough." The whispers rose around me, louder now, a cacophony of voices pleading, warning, accusing. I felt them pressing against my skull, clawing at my thoughts. "Why me?" I shouted, the question tearing from my throat. "Because you saw," he said simply, taking another step forward. "Because you crossed when you shouldn't have. This place," he gestured to the viaduct, "isn't yours. It belongs to them." "Them?" I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. He raised a hand, gloved in black, and pointed toward the darkness beneath the arches. At first I saw nothing, but then shapes began to emerge. Figures, countless and featureless, their forms shimmering like shadows cast by firelight. They moved toward me, their footsteps silent but their presence deafening. "You've carried their weight for too long," the tall man said. "It's time to join them." I stumbled back, my breath catching as the shadows surged forward. My body felt heavy, like the air around me had turned to lead. The whispers grew deafening, each voice a piece of a story I couldn't understand but felt in my bones. "No!" I shouted, forcing myself to stand. "I don't belong here!" The tall man stopped, his featureless face tilting as if considering my words. Then, for the first time, he laughed, a low, hollow sound that chilled me to the core. "You already do." As the shadows reached me, the world shifted. The frost, the viaduct, the town. They all blurred together, fading into an endless void. And in that void, I saw them. The faces of those who had come before. Maggie, Blake, others whose names I didn't know but whose presence I felt like a weight in my chest. And then I was one of them, a shadow among shadows, caught in the endless pull of the viaduct's whispers. The tall man watched, his red right hand glowing faintly in the dark, before he turned and vanished, leaving nothing but silence behind.